We're really talking about strategy. And we're talking about strategy as something that we call the sine qua non for success. That is, if you don't have good strategy, you are unlikely to win. You may win, but your probability of winning, your chances of winning in the absence of a good strategy are simply not very high. So what we want to do is talk about how we can be more strategic in regardless of what it is that we want to do. What we want to end up doing really is to make strategy a way of life, because it applies not only at our corporate levels, our nonprofit levels, but it also even applies to our personal level. So the ideas we're going to be talking about today have application in all three of those different areas, and indeed in anything else where there's any degree of competitiveness, whether that competitiveness is with another organization or is merely overcoming problems in an environment, problems of lack of funds or whatever it may happen to be. When you get right down to it, we can break strategy down into 4 simple words. Those are: where are you going? What are you going to put your resources against? How are you going to apply your resources? And how are you going to end everything that you do? So those 4 words, if you think about anything that you're doing, and if you haven't answered those questions, you do not have a strategic plan. So now that sitting back here, a couple years before that future picture, we can see it out there on the horizon, and we have a pretty darn good idea of what needs to happen in order for us to get from here to that future picture that we have put out on the horizon, the beacon, which is for ourselves and for everybody in the organization. And you can see they're all going in different directions. If we went up to one of these people represented by one of these arrows and say, "Are you working hard?" They would say, "Yes, we're working very, very hard." And you say, "Are you working well?" And they would say, "We're working very well." So how do you know you're working well? So, well, here's my performance report, here's my bonus check for the last quarter. Absolutely, I'm working well and doing a great job for the company. There's a problem here with this, and that is that, as depicted by the fact that the arrows are all going in different ways, that what you're finding, because this is a typically tactically focused organization, you are finding that these people are all optimizing at their own level, and when they optimize at their own level, that they are sub-optimizing for the overall organization. So what we end up seeing is this: everybody working really hard, but not giving the impetus to the organization that it would like to have, and in fact that all that hard work doesn't produce any increase in value of the overall company. Clearly something that is undesirable. That's not what we want. Now, if we have thought through all of the things we've talked about, and obviously that there's more detail, we can take this circumstance that we saw at the beginning, with all of these arrows going in different directions, all of these people working really, really hard but not taking the organization anyplace. We can convert that situation by having a strategically focused organization. The strategically focused organization gets the arrows not lined up perfectly, but generally going in the same direction. And now when people are working, when they are doing things, that they are moving their organization in the same general direction and taking the company value, the nonprofit value, to higher and higher levels. In other words, the same amount of work on the part of the individuals in a strategically focused organization does far more for the company than that same amount of work accomplishes for the tactically focused company. I believe very, very strongly that the very best planning is planning that is done in the open. So we talk about the concept of planning and operating in the open. Now, as we all know, many organizations, and perhaps most organizations, do not plan and operate in the open. That what they do is that they'll get a small group of people at the executive level, board level, that make some decisions and then tell people what to do. And then they're almost always surprised when what they tell people to do doesn't happen for a variety of reasons. This planning and operating in the open had enormous advantages, and I'll just enumerate a few of them. First of all, when you got a lot of people in a room, 200 people in a room, there was almost always somebody who knew the answer to virtually any question that you might pose. And if there wasn't somebody that knew the answer, which was somewhat unusual, always there was somebody that knew somebody that they could call, pick up the phone and call and get the answer. So rather than this having all of these people slowing the planning down, it actually speeded it up because it gave us the information we needed much faster. Here is sort of a typical product curve. It starts off someplace down here, yet the sales, profits grow. Someplace it starts to flatten out, start to fall. Someplace you're losing money, and at some point the thing ends. I mean, this basically happens to every product that has ever existed. Now, the problem that we run into here is that when you look at this thing, you say, well, obviously, who would be stupid enough to fall all the way down the backside of this curve? Well, the answer is almost everybody does that. And the reason they do it is because of human nature. When things start going a little bit south, and when that curve starts falling off, rather than people saying, okay, the product has served its useful lifetime, move on to something else or a significant variation or whatever, what they say is, well, this is my product. I can't admit that this thing isn't failing. I've got to work harder. Or I've got to get a new ad agency. Or we got to get a new item manager. Or. Excuse after excuse for why this is happening, and people working harder and harder, but doesn't make any difference because this thing's in a secular downturn. The way we address this problem is to think about it in advance. It's entirely possible and reasonable to predict the general shape of this curve. And if we think about this in advance and say when we get up into here at some point, that's the place where we are going to get out, move into a significant variation, maybe sell the whole thing off to somebody else, whatever it may happens to be. Here we can make rational decisions. Here we're stuck in the irrational emotional world of attachment to our particular product or whatever it may happen to be. So back here we define what our conditions of success are and when we are going to move away from this particular thing. Now this is a rational decision back here, and when we get to this circumstance up in here, now people say, hey, we've succeeded. This is where we wanted to be. Now let's move on from this, sell it off, or whatever it may happen to be. It's a completely different approach, a completely different world. And although we've been dealing with this for, I don't know, 100,000 years, something like that, that we haven't learned very much about this. But there is a solution. You can solve that problem. There's no reason to fall down the backside of this curve. Here's an example of strategy at work. This was one of our companies that we worked with several years ago. We're looking at their market capitalization. This was a high-tech company. We're looking at their market capitalization over a long period of time. And you can see that virtually nothing happened, although the general market was going up nicely during that period of time. Somewhere in here in the early 90s, the company began to say, what's wrong? And they looked around at their engineers and their people and so on and said, ours is as good as anybody else in the industry and probably better in a lot of ways. Why is it that we're doing relatively so poorly? And they began to say, the problem is that we're not thinking strategically. And they started focusing on strategy. We had the opportunity to come in and start helping them in late 1995, 1996. And as a result of strategic attention, strategic focus, the organization was able to see these extraordinary gains in their market capitalization. And this particular company, the CEO, the COO now, attribute this success not to the fact that they got different people, that their products were any better than they had previously been, but the fact that they started thinking and acting strategically as a company. And I think this is a pretty good indication of the kinds of things that in fact can flow out of genuine strategy thinking, not necessarily spending any more money, in fact in some cases spending a lot less money, not necessarily getting new people, but simply rethinking how you're going about doing things in order to have a strategic focus.